In the calculus of historical memory, some horrors fade not because they were smaller, but because they were more complete. The Arab slave trade, spanning over 13 centuries from the 7th to the 20th, moved between 10 and 18 million Africans across the Sahara and Indian Ocean. Yet today, no substantial African diaspora exists in the Middle East or North Africa to bear witness. The descendants simply aren't there. This is not an accident of history. It is history's design. The Atlantic slave trade, for all its brutality, created populations. The Arab slave trade created absences. To understand why requires examining a commerce predicated not on labor reproduction but on human consumption. A system that targeted women and children with deliberate precision, that deployed castration as industrial policy, and that succeeded so thoroughly in erasing African identity that its very success has hidden it from collective memory. What happened to African women in this trade defied the usual economics of slavery. It defied the usual patterns of survival. And it reveals something about the limits of power that we have yet to fully comprehend. Every slave system has its logic. The Atlantic trade demanded workers who could reproduce themselves, family units that would create new generations of enslaved labor on Caribbean and American plantations. The arithmetic was brutal but clear: preserve fertility, maintain populations, extract maximum value across generations. The Arab slave trade operated on fundamentally different mathematics. Arab merchants focused on concubinage, capturing women and girls to serve as sex slaves in harems, with demands so high that merchants would often double their prices. The ratio of captured women to men reached 3-to-1. This wasn't an incidental preference. It was structural policy encoded in market prices and trading practices across more than a millennium. When European merchants scoured West African coasts for strong young men to work plantations, Arab merchants were selecting girls as young as 7, women in their prime childbearing years, specifically for sexual service and domestic labor. The Swiss explorer Johann Burckhardt, traveling through Nubia and Egypt in 1814, documented what he witnessed with clinical horror. Very few female slaves who had passed their 10th year reached Egypt or Arabia in a state of virginity. The implication was clear even then. These were not workers. They were consumables. But the market told a more complex story. In Zanzibar's slave market, a fresh boy newly arrived from the mainland sold for $7 to $15 in 1857, while a girl between 7 and 8 years old commanded $10 to $18. The premium wasn't for strength or endurance. It was for something else entirely, for the specific vulnerability that made a child suitable for a harem, for the malleability that allowed forced assimilation, for the reproductive capacity that would be owned absolutely. Economic logic suggested this system should have produced African populations throughout the Arab world even larger than those in the Americas. 3 women for every man, over 13 centuries, should have created massive demographic presence. The absence of such populations becomes the central mystery that reveals the trade's true nature. The journey itself was designed to break identity before arrival. Captured in the interior regions of Central and East Africa, from what are now Tanzania, Mozambique, Congo, and Malawi, enslaved people faced a forced march of weeks or months toward the coast. The crossing could last up to 3 months, with an estimated 50% of enslaved individuals dying during transit from brutal conditions. David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary and explorer whose letters would ultimately help end the East African trade, witnessed these caravans in the 1860s. His journal entries read like dispatches from an ongoing apocalypse. In June 1866, he recorded passing a slave woman shot through the body and left dying on the path. Witnesses said an Arab trader had killed her in anger at losing his investment because she could no longer walk. The same day, he found a man dead from starvation, and slaves abandoned with slave sticks still on their necks, too weak to speak or identify where they'd come from. But Livingstone's most devastating observation was medical rather than visual. The strangest disease I have seen in this country seems really to be brokenheartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. This wasn't metaphor. He was documenting a physiological response to total loss, of family, of home, of future, of self. For women and girls, the trauma began before the march ended. The rape of captives was systematic, not incidental. These weren't isolated acts of violence but deliberate policy, a way of beginning the process of domination and erasure that would continue at destination. A captain from the East India Company visiting Zanzibar in 1811 described how buyers examined slaves, noting he had seen the breasts of girls examined in the most indecent manner in the public market, their bodies inspected with no regard for dignity. The Zanzibar slave market, which processed up to 50,000 people annually at its 19th century peak, exemplified the industrial scale of dehumanization. Slaves were kept in underground chambers, 50 men in one room, 75 women and children in another, separated but equally confined, held for 3 days before auction with no toilet and no light, only drainage channels below that served as latrines when high tide washed through. Many died of suffocation and starvation before reaching the auction block. Those who survived faced examination that treated them as livestock. Teeth were inspected, bodies examined thoroughly, and then they were made to walk or run to demonstrate the absence of defects. Only then would the negotiation over their price begin. What made the Arab trade distinctive wasn't merely its cruelty. Atlantic slavery was equally brutal in its own ways, but its specific target. Where Atlantic traders wanted workers who could last decades, Arab traders wanted bodies that could be consumed, replaced, and consumed again. The most revealing aspect of the Arab slave trade wasn't what it did to those enslaved during their lives, but what it did to prevent their children from existing at all. Castration was routine for male slaves, particularly boys between 8 and 12. The procedure involved complete removal of both scrotums and penises. As many as 6 out of every 10 boys bled to death during the process. This wasn't punishment or isolated practice. It was systematic industrial policy applied across the trade for over a millennium. The mortality rates were absolutely huge. Black eunuchs were made by what was called level with the abdomen castration, ensuring no possibility of reproduction. The economic logic was perverse but coherent. Eunuchs commanded extremely high prices in slave markets. A good eunuch could cost up to 100 wikiya, making them expensive commodities despite the dangerous castration procedure carried out in specialized centers. The high price made the massive mortality rate acceptable to traders. If 60% died during castration, the 40% who survived were worth 3 times as much. But the policy's true purpose became clear in its effects on population. Historians estimate that to yield 9 million castrated boys arriving at markets over 1,300 years, assuming an 80% mortality rate during castration alone, Arab slavers would have had to seize 45 million boys from the African interior. This doesn't count the 50% who died during the march itself. For women, the prevention of continuity took different but equally effective forms. Sultan Barghash Ibn said of Zanzibar, who reigned from 1870 to 1888, had one wife but a large harem of concubines. His wife set a condition. He could have as many slaves as he wanted, but couldn't acknowledge any children born to them. Without acknowledgement of paternity, these children had no legal identity, no inheritance, no family name. They vanished into the vast category of the unrecorded. This pattern repeated across the Arab world. Even when slave women bore children to their masters, Islamic law's provision for walid, mother of the child, a status that offered some protection, was routinely denied by jealous wives or indifferent masters. The children of slave mothers were absorbed into households as servants themselves, their African heritage deliberately obscured, their lineage ending within a generation. The contrast with Atlantic slavery is stark. Despite laws against slave literacy and family recognition, despite systematic brutality, the plantation system's economic logic required enslaved populations to reproduce. Families formed, even under oppression. Grandparents knew grandchildren. Cultural transmission, however fragmented, occurred. The Arab trade's mathematics worked differently. The high mortality rate from castration, harsh treatment, and eventual assimilation into local populations led to the erasure of cultural and ethnic identities over generations. No Gullah culture developed. No Creole languages emerged. No recognizable African communities persisted to claim heritage. Where the Atlantic trade created the foundation for jazz, for Caribbean carnival, for the Harlem Renaissance, where it created, through unspeakable suffering, new forms of African diaspora culture. The Arab trade created silence. In 1871, at a market town near Lake Tanganyika, David Livingstone witnessed an event that encapsulated the Arab slave trade's essential character. An Arab trader named Dugum, seeking monopoly control, ordered the massacre of competitors and their associated populations. 400 villagers, mostly unarmed women, were gunned down. Those attempting to flee across a nearby river were shot in the water, aimed at their exposed heads. 12 villages burned in the aftermath. This wasn't slavery seeking profit through controlled exploitation. This was elimination masquerading as commerce. Livingstone's final years were consumed by documenting these horrors. He traveled deeper into the interior than any European before him, always alongside the Arab trading caravans that were simultaneously his transportation and the object of his witness. On one captured dhow, British naval officers found 23 women crammed onto stones used as ballast, literally doubled up with no room to sit erect, some holding infants. Above them, 48 men were crowded the same way, and above that, 53 children. Many were in the last stages of starvation and dysentery. The British abolition movement seized on Livingstone's letters. His accounts reached Parliament, reached newspapers, reached the public conscience. In 1873, just weeks after Livingstone died in a remote village on Lake Tanganyika, Britain threatened naval blockade of Zanzibar unless Sultan Barghash closed the slave markets. The markets closed. Slavery itself wasn't abolished in Zanzibar until 1909, but the trade's most visible manifestation ended. Yet the closure of markets didn't end the practice immediately. Slavery persisted in Saudi Arabia and Yemen until 1962, in Oman until 1970, in Mauritania until 1981, formally, at least. Today, forms of bonded labor and exploitation continue across North Africa and the Gulf states, with African migrant workers experiencing conditions that echo the historical trade's dehumanization. The demographic evidence tells the larger story. The Atlantic slave trade, which operated for roughly 4 centuries and transported approximately 12 million people to the Americas, created African diaspora populations that now number over 140 million. The Arab slave trade, operating for 13 centuries and moving between 10 and 18 million people, left essentially no comparable diaspora. The arithmetic doesn't work unless the goal was never population maintenance but population prevention. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their names, languages, and traditions, absorbed into foreign societies where they had no claim to their past, often forcibly converted to Islam and integrated into households as concubines, servants, or soldiers. The process was so thorough that today's researchers struggle to trace lineages. The descendants exist. Certainly, genetics confirms African heritage throughout Yemen, the Gulf states, North Africa, but they exist as Arabs, as Yemenis, as Egyptians, as anything but African. The cultural erasure was complete. In the conventional narrative of slave trades, success means profit extracted, labor deployed, systems maintained. By these metrics, both Atlantic and Arab trade succeeded. Horrifically. But they succeeded in fundamentally different ways, toward fundamentally different ends. The Atlantic trade succeeded by creating sustainable extraction systems. It failed to eliminate African identity. Indeed, it couldn't, because that identity's preservation was necessary for its own continuation. The culture survived in spirituals and folk tales, in naming practices and family bonds, in the small spaces where power couldn't fully reach. Emancipation was followed by Reconstruction, then Jim Crow, then civil rights, a long arc of struggle toward recognition and equity that continues today. The descendants are there to fight for it. The Arab trade succeeded by preventing that fight from ever occurring. It succeeded so completely at eliminating lineage that there was no one left to demand recognition, no community to organize for rights, no diaspora to claim heritage. It failed only in the sense that its most extreme practices eventually drew international condemnation and forced formal abolition. But by the time markets closed, the demographic work was done. This reveals something about power that conventional analysis misses. The most successful forms of domination aren't those that can be measured in immediate profit or visible control. They're the ones that make themselves invisible by eliminating the possibility of resistance itself. If you can prevent populations from forming, prevent families from continuing, prevent identity from transmitting across generations, you don't need to maintain systems of oppression into perpetuity. The oppression becomes self-executing through absence. What makes this historically exceptional is that it shouldn't have worked. Every model of slavery, every economic analysis, every demographic projection suggests that large-scale forced migration of women of childbearing age should produce population growth at the destination. The Arab trade moved millions of women specifically selected for reproductive capacity over more than a millennium into regions with established infrastructure and relatively stable political systems. The population should exist. Their descendants should be there. That they aren't reveals deliberate policy enacted across centuries, across empires, across changing dynasties and theological dispensations. The policy was preventing African continuity in Arab lands, and the tools were castration, forced assimilation, denial of legal identity to children, and constant replacement of populations that didn't reproduce themselves. The Atlantic trade could be defeated because it created populations who could fight back. The Arab trade could only be defeated by outside intervention, by British naval power backed by abolitionist sentiment that Livingstone's letters had helped generate. The enslaved themselves couldn't organize resistance at scale because they weren't allowed to exist as a coherent group. Today, the physical architecture of the Arab slave trade has become heritage tourism. The underground slave chambers in Zanzibar, where women and children waited in darkness, are now museum spaces where guides recite statistics. The Anglican Cathedral in Stone Town stands where the whipping post once tested slaves' endurance for buyers. The altar occupies the exact spot where human beings were displayed for purchase. The memorial sculpture, 5 figures in chains emerging from a pit, captures something essential about the trade's nature. These aren't figures triumphantly breaking chains. They're figures becoming visible, emerging from earth, from absence itself. The power of the memorial lies in what it makes present that had been made to disappear. But memorialization runs into the same problem as historical analysis. Who claims this heritage? In the Americas, descendants of the enslaved have spent centuries fighting to control their own narrative, to transform traumatic history into cultural strength, to make the passage from slavery to freedom mean something in contemporary politics. In the Arab world and North Africa, that fight hasn't happened because the descendants can't be identified as a coherent group. The African heritage was too thoroughly erased. This creates a peculiar historical situation. The Atlantic slave trade remains central to discussions of race, colonialism, and justice because its effects are living, present, and ongoing. The Arab slave trade, despite being longer, possibly larger, and arguably more brutal in its systematic elimination of identity, remains marginal to those same discussions. It's forgotten not because people chose to forget but because there's no living constituency to force remembrance. The lasting impact appears in different forms. Today's discrimination and abuse toward Africans in North Africa and the Middle East, whether as domestic workers in wealthy families or construction laborers in Qatar, carries echoes of historical exploitation, with historical trade routes continuing to influence economic relations. The migrant crisis, the trafficking networks, the reports of slave markets operating in Libya in the 21st century, these aren't random occurrences but patterns built on infrastructure and attitudes developed over 13 centuries of treating African bodies as commodities. The Arab slave trade also reveals something about historical memory itself. We remember what we can organize around. We memorialize what has constituencies to demand memorialization. We study what has living relevance to contemporary struggles. The erasure of African populations from Arab lands means the erasure of this history from collective consciousness, which perpetuates the conditions that allow contemporary exploitation to continue. But perhaps the most significant revelation concerns the nature of successful oppression. The Atlantic trade, for all its power, left resistance possible. It created Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. It created quilombos in Brazil and maroon communities in Jamaica. It created conditions where resistance was difficult, costly, often fatal, but imaginable. The Arab trade's genius was making resistance unimaginable by making the population itself impossible. You can't resist if you don't exist as a coherent group. You can't organize if your children don't know their parents' origins. You can't fight for recognition if you've been successfully assimilated into the oppressor's identity. In the taxonomy of historical atrocities, the Arab slave trade occupies a unique position. It was both massively scaled and almost completely successful at its ultimate goal, not just profit extraction but demographic elimination. It moved as many people as the Atlantic trade, over 3 times as long a period, and left almost no trace of their descendants as a distinct population. This makes it exceptional in the worst possible way. Most systems of oppression fail eventually because they create their own opposition. They concentrate populations, which allows for organizing. They create shared experience, which allows for solidarity. They produce visible injustice, which generates resistance. The Arab trade circumvented all of this by preventing the oppressed from existing as a population at all. What this reveals about power is unsettling. The most effective domination isn't visible control maintained through force. It's elimination disguised as assimilation, administered through economic incentives that make human beings replaceable rather than renewable. It's castration as industrial policy, forced conversion as demographic strategy, the denial of children's parentage as a method of preventing lineage. The limits of this power appear only in its eventual formal prohibition, not from internal reform or slave resistance, but from external pressure by European abolitionists who themselves had only recently abandoned the Atlantic trade. Even then, the prohibition was delayed, contested, and incompletely enforced for another century. The Arab slave trade succeeded where the Atlantic trade failed, in making itself forgettable by making its victims' descendants invisible. It failed where the Atlantic trade succeeded, in creating systems sustainable enough to adapt to formal abolition. But by the time it ended, the demographic work was already done. Today, when we speak of slave trades and their legacies, we mean almost exclusively the Atlantic system. This isn't because the Atlantic trade was larger or lasted longer or was more brutal. It's because it failed to erase its victims thoroughly enough to prevent them from becoming subjects of their own history. The Arab slave trade left a different legacy, an absence so profound it becomes evidence, a silence so complete it speaks volumes, a disappearance so successful it has nearly disappeared from historical memory itself. That this could happen over 13 centuries, to millions of people, particularly to women and children who should have left descendants to bear witness, remains one of history's most disturbing revelations about what power can accomplish when its goal is not exploitation but elimination. And perhaps that's the final lesson. The most dangerous forms of oppression aren't those we remember to resist. They're the ones successful enough to make resistance impossible by preventing the oppressed from existing as a coherent group at all. The Atlantic trade created populations. The Arab trade created absences. The populations fought back and won recognition, however incomplete and ongoing that struggle remains. The absences can't fight back because there's no one there to fight. This is why the Arab slave trade remains an exception, and why understanding it matters for understanding the true limits and true capabilities of organized human cruelty across time.